I'd like to introduce Frankie Dunleavy now of the Vermont Humanities Council to introduce tonight's speaker. Thanks.
On behalf of the Humanities Council, I too would just like to say that it's wonderful to see so many people on the 2nd of January. Instead of que la fête commence, it might be que la fête continue. Et voilà. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Paul Searls, teaches American history at Lyndon State College and the University of Vermont, and serves on the executive board of the Center for Research on Vermont. He received his PhD from New York University and is the author of Two Vermonts, Geography and Identity, 1865 to 1910. He is currently at work on a second volume of his book that will trace the years between 1910 and 1946. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Searls.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Is the sound good? People can hear me good? Does that sound good? I'm very wired. I think one of these is measuring like my heart rate or my cholesterol level or something like that. All these wires. That sounds good, though? Okay. I'd very much like to thank the Vermont Humanities Council for arranging this tonight, and particularly Allie White. And I'd like to thank the staff at the Ilsley Library for hosting me tonight, and particularly Chris Kirby. And most of all, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out on a night in such proximity to a holiday and on such a cold night. I actually am really happy to see a next student here, Jim Peabody, and as I was telling him, I feel always like I learned a lot more from my students than than I taught them. And I always feel like the fun part of these talks for me is what I can hear from you. And a successful talk is measured by how much I can get you eventually to give me your ideas and thoughts. I just want to share a few ideas with you I have about Vermont in the past as it compares to the present. And this is a talk called Vermont Then and Now, which is really to say it's about what we can learn from the past that informs us about the present and how we can use that information in order to negotiate the future. And I think it's a very good time as a state collectively for us to start and to continue, and particularly with greater significance, to worry about where we're going in the future. The Vermont Council on Rural Development right about now is starting a series of conversations on Vermont's future. And I'd encourage you to look that up on the web and to take part in those, because there is the special feeling that we're at a sort of transitional period, at a crossroads in Vermont's history. This comes in a number of different forms. An economist at UVM named Art Wolf calls it Vermont's ticking time bomb, which is to say that we have a number of challenges which we'll face in the next generation, having to do with the aging of Vermont's population, the decline in the number of school-age children we have, yet the increase in cost of education and social services, and that these are some real problems that we have to deal with right now. And as well, of course, I think that this is sort of there's a general sense that this is a very key transitional period in global history. Of course, I mean, mainly people feel this way about the environment, and environmental concerns are at the forefront, hopefully, of most people's minds. Al Gore put it very eloquently at his Nobel Peace Prize reception a little while ago when he said that either one of two things can happen. Either future generations will look back at us and say, why didn't you do more? Or they'll look back at us and say, how did you get the courage to do what you did? But also, just in a general global sense, the feeling that we're at a very special moment in globalization in terms of whether we can negotiate the increasingly small size of the globe in a way that makes it so that we can have a cooperative globe based on cultural understanding and non-exploitative relationships, or whether we'll have a globe based on cultural clashes and conflict and increasing inequalities. And so when we look at this kind of future for ourselves, we wonder, what can Vermont teach us that will help us on both a statewide, a townwide, and also a global level to help us negotiate the future? And it seems like a funny thing that Vermont would be a place where we could start to sort out these problems. I mean, we are a small state tucked away in the northern part of the United States with a small population. Just a couple weeks ago, I had one of those moments that everyone here has surely had, where I was trying to sort out a present with Land's End, actually, and calling them on the phone in Wisconsin, and had one of those moments where I said, and now the address is, I'm from Vermont, and the person inevitably said, what state is that in? And everyone's had that experience, I'm sure. And so, it may be kind of presumptuous or even arrogant to say that Vermont has a lesson that it can teach the rest of the world about how we can learn from the past in order to inform our present to take actions which will shape the future. I happen to be a person who loves Vermont very much, and so I might have a sort of inflated perception of how important Vermont is on a global scale. But I really do believe that Vermont has a very special message, a very special role in the world that it can play based on its inherited past. And that role is based in the fact that Vermont's origins, in the fact that Vermont began not just as a state, but as an idea, and not just as an idea, but as a challenge. And that challenge is organized around the idea of balance. Now, when Vermont was being founded in the 1770s, its future was very uncertain, and it was embattled on many sides: Yorkers, the British, the Continental Congress, dissenters within the state's boundaries. And so it had to come up with an idea which was exciting to people and which could captivate their imaginations and draw them in and make them feel like they were part of an experiment in human living. And the experiment in human living, the concept that the founders came up with, was this an idea that Vermont would be the place that reconciled freedom and unity, the needs of the individual, needs of the community, which is a very exalted ambition, to say the least. And over time, this search for balance, this search to reconcile the most contrasting aspects of the human condition have manifested themselves in many consequential ways that flow out of this desire to balance the needs of the individual. Everyone wants to be free and self-gratified with the needs of the community. Everyone wants to live in a place with neighborliness and cooperation. And some of the ways in which this has played itself out is trying to reconcile such contrasting dynamics as preservation and development, progress and tradition, the past and the future. Over time, the desire, the attempt to reconcile these contrasting impulses of everyday life have been a challenge that have never really been fully achieved. It sounds like a great goal to reconcile these fundamental aspects of the human condition, but actually bringing it into being and putting it into practice is a much more difficult thing to achieve. And the problem arose in many forms and virtually right away. Vermont's Constitution, which some historians would say is the most radical document of the Revolutionary era, attempted to, on the one hand, service the needs of the individual in ways that were breathtakingly original, but also to create consensus and homogeneity and a cooperative atmosphere. And in the process, immediately set people to squabbling about how you bring this about. It made people devote themselves to principles which they didn't necessarily believe in. And so therefore, the problems in trying to achieve this goal appeared almost immediately. Frustration ensued, and to a great extent, Vermont's history has always been about moving towards this goal, and also about conflict over what the form that goal would take. Now, my original interest in Vermont history long ago was in the 1930s, which is as an example of how this attempt to achieve balance, this attempt to reconcile the needs of the individual and the community, manifests themselves. As I was beginning to delve into Vermont's past, about the 1930s, I was viewing an essential battle over how Vermont would negotiate the New Deal. Clearly, a lot of the structures that Vermont had at the time, both social, political, governmental, were not working, were not in a shape that could handle the challenges of the Great Depression. But at the same time, there were beautiful things about Vermont tradition at the time. Its emphasis on local control, on an educated, participatory citizenry, things that were going to be severely challenged by the degree to which Vermont embraced the expansion of federal programs. And so what was going on in the 1930s was this large discussion about what Vermont should and shouldn't do as far as embracing modern solutions to very modern problems in a way that doesn't mean that it will lose those beautiful things about its tradition and its past that it valued so much. And just beginning my interest into Vermont's past, what I observed was that the whole discussion, this narrative that Vermonters were taking part in at the time about how Vermont should negotiate change, was being spoken of through the lens of this question about who is a Vermonter, and what does a Vermonter do, and what is appropriate for Vermonters to embrace or to reject. The question of who is a Vermonter was utterly essential, was at the core of this discussion about how Vermont should negotiate change. And in that way, the question who is a Vermonter is much more than simply a question of who belongs, who is appropriately able to embrace that designation. It's more a question of what is Vermont, and what will Vermont be in the future, and what's appropriate for Vermont. One of the really fascinating things going on in the 1930s was sort of what you would call the expansion of the term who is a Vermonter, or the boundaries of who was a Vermonter were in the process of being redefined. For a long time, people of non-Yankee heritage, French Canadians, Irish, Italians, had at best, depending upon who you were talking to, questionable right to claim the designation Vermonter. And during this period in the 1930s, amidst this social change and upheaval, there was a great amount of discussion and reinterpretation of who belongs in this, as a member of this community. Do members of labor unions deserve the designation Vermonter? Are labor unions even an appropriate institution for Vermont? Or does a real Vermonter never join unions? And people talked about this the whole time. And so this was what I needed to go back in time and begin to try to understand. And what was clear to me, both in the early 1990s and mid-1990s, as it was clear to me in my research in the 1930s, is that Vermont had a basic division to it, which I needed to try to grapple with and try to understand. It seemed that throughout all of Vermont's historiography, the way in which historians had talked about it and writers had written about it, that there was this basic division between two separate kinds of people which pervaded Vermont's past, but I didn't have articulate terms in order to describe it. I knew that it was in many ways about people who were born in the state, or even more importantly, and it does really matter, people who'd lived in individual towns for many years and had generations going back in individual towns versus newcomers. Natives versus transients, immigrants, did matter. I knew that it was about employment. Some people are lawyers and some people are dairy farmers, but I knew it was bigger than that. I knew it was about where you live. Belvedere is very different from Burlington, and I knew that. I knew it was about ethnicity. French Canadians and Yankees were not the same. But all these things were components of something which was much bigger, which was about identity, which was about ideology. And I struggled as I tried to write about and think about these categories, to organize the state in my mind, until finally I'm very grateful to a historian named Robert Shallhope, who wrote a wonderful book called Bennington and the Green Mountain Boys in the mid-1990s, thankfully for me at just the right time, in which he wrote about Bennington in the early Republic period. And he organized the people just in Bennington into what he called his uphillers and his downhillers. And the downhillers, the uphillers had been the original settlers in town. They had settled on the top of a hill there in Bennington and had been frontier farmers and had been responsible essentially for founding the state. And then as Vermont moved past its frontier period, the businessmen and the merchants, the lawyers, the doctors, had moved in down in the mill village where the river flows, and the downhill part of town. And so then they immediately set to hating each other and arguing about the town's future at great length and with great vigor. But as Shallhope makes clear, the division between uphillers and downhillers was not geographic at its heart. It was ideological. Uphillers were local in their orientation. They were informal in their thinking. They were cooperative. They emphasized tradition. Where downhillers were formal, legalistic, progressive, contractual in the way that they thought about the world. So therefore it was about really, the two different separate worldviews. And this made perfect sense to me I had tried to write, and if I had written a book in which I called the one group of people cosmopolitans and the other parochials, none of you would have been able to read the first sentence. It was wretched. But luckily, Uphill and Downhill made perfect sense for me, and then I could proceed to move forward and speak about the things I wanted to speak about. So, and then, as Jim actually knows, I did try out the uphill and downhill categories at UVM when I was teaching Vermont history, and I don't remember, what were you?
I was uphill.
You were uphill? Okay, which is probably a bit of a stretch for you, but gave you a sense of how other people live. You know, I organized them into uphill and downhill villages and gave them primary documents, and particularly when I had the kids from like the hilltops in Newark who immediately understood what I was talking about, then I knew that I was really on to something. And one of the things that they would frequently say is by the time I'd really sort of organized these categories, the uphillers are sort of the rural hill farmers and the downhillers live in Burlington, they would say, well, almost immediately they'd say, well, it's just like now. I would spring these kinds of quotes on them at the time. In 1792, a speaker at a militia gathering in Benson gave a toast that Vermont, and this is an uphiller, be long defended from the inundation which is threatened by the increase of aristocrats from the coast who wish for a rich metropolis and a poor peasantry. In 1793, which was a very contentious election year, a uphill spokesman said it's a battle between the common people against a new set of gentry who are interested in keeping the government at a distance from and out of the sight of the people who support it. And I was giving people these lines in about the year 2000 and 2001, which were very, very interesting years to live in Vermont, at the height of the Take Back Vermont movement. If you are a scholar or even a collector like I am of clippings from newspapers where people argue about who is and who isn't a Vermonter, your clipping file filled very quickly in 2000 and 2001. And so at that point, a lot of people said, well, seems like it's very much like now. And it made sense to them and resonated with them, and that was a really gratifying thing for me. I felt like I could move forward and begin to speak intelligently about how there is continuity across time in the state between broadly defined categories of people, not based solely on where they live or where they were born or what they do for a living, but how they think. Now, moving a step past that, if I can hopefully make a connection between the past and the future, I need to come up with ways in which these categories operated in tandem with each other. So I try to think of like the most basic characteristic that defined uphillers and downhillers in the past and in the present. And what worked for me, what made the most sense for me, is first of all about uphillers. The one thing I could say about them is that uphillers don't see the big picture. And that was really sort of across time seemed to make a lot of sense to me. An example that I have that makes sense about that. They don't understand how their backyard is connected to the outside world. They don't understand how the challenges they face on a day-to-day basis are about very large problems far too often. And I would say an example is that during the height of the anti-Masonic period in the 1830s, in my own hometown now of Danville, the only two Masonic Lodge members were the one merchant in town and the one banker in town. And at the time, Danville was the county seat of Caledonia County, but it was in decline as the fortunes of St. Johnsbury rose. And a lot of the farmers were falling into debt to this banker and this merchant, and experiencing very hard times. So what they did is that they got angrier and angrier at these two people who seemed to represent everything about power moving to isolated and invisible and inaccessible places, and they held speeches on this behalf, and they organized an anti-Masonic lodge, and they became members of the anti-Masonic party, and worked themselves up into such a frenzy that they passed resolutions that the banker and the merchant should be cast out from town, which they did do. They moved to St. Johnsbury. But if you want to turn around the economic fortunes of your town, to chase out the merchant and the banker is a terrible idea. And Danville is a delightfully small and boring town ever since. And the one thing I decided about downhillers that made the most sense over time in the 1790s, as in the 1880s, as in the 21st century, was that downhillers just don't understand uphillers at all. They don't understand why they drink the beer they drink, or why they watch the shows they watch on television, or why they farm the way they farm, or teach the kids what they teach. They just don't understand why uphillers do what they do on virtually any level. A good example of this is if you know the story of the Bourne Colvin murder trial in Manchester, Vermont, which took place in 1817. What happened is that there had been a fight in a field between two brothers and their brother-in-law, and in 1812, 5 years before, and the result had been that the two brothers had returned to the farmhouse and said that their brother-in-law had run off and disappeared. And well, years passed and people began to wonder what had happened. Did he really run off? There had been a fight, there had been an argument, no one really knew for sure. And eventually it came around to a lot of circumstantial evidence resulting in the arrest and then eventually a confession by the Bourne brothers that they had in fact murdered Russell Colvin. But miraculously, just as the execution of one of the brothers was to take place, Russell Colvin reappeared. He was working on a farm in New Jersey. And a Manchester resident who happened to be living in New York City had run across him and heard about the story of Stephen Bourne, and in order to prevent this terrible miscarriage of justice, had transported Russell Colvin, the mysterious, theoretically murdered man, back to Manchester, where he identified all the players in the scenario and said he hadn't been murdered, but had run off, and then wanted to return to New Jersey, and off he went. And as time went by afterwards, of course, the downhillers in town wondered, well, was that the real Russell Colvin? And they would ask the uphillers, because this was a very East Manchester event, this conflict in this field and what had subsequently taken place, well, what happened with that? And of course, the uphillers would say, oh, that's all in the past. Yeah, it was the real Russell Colvin. And downhillers in Manchester to this day wonder about that. But the truth is that one way that I really like to think of it is that uphillers never tell downhillers their secrets. Uphillers never tell downhillers their secrets. You can move into a small town and live there for many, many years, and the old families that live there for many generations will welcome you, and you will be kind towards you. They will plow your driveway when you need it plowed. But there's a level of community, a level of association that you'll never penetrate. Uphillers never tell downhillers their secrets. Downhillers don't understand uphillers at all. Now, this has played itself out over time, in many different ways. I like to think of it in the present in such conflicts, there are such sort of debates as there was a really good debate a couple years ago about whether there should be a Walmart in St. Albans. And a lot of the downhillers were very wound up about this because it destroys local businesses and removes money from the Vermont economy and is exploitative towards third world workers, China and all of that. And so they would say, global capitalism. And the uphillers would say, cheap Toby Keith CDs, or, cheap crock pots or something like this. And the downhillers would say, who's Toby Keith? And so it was like, phew, they just were talking right past each other. You might have, another good example is the recent debates in town meetings across Vermont about whether the town meetings should act on resolutions about, say, speaking about whether President Bush should be impeached or whether there should be a resolution against the Iraq War. And, downhillers have this romantic notion that town meeting is the most exalted form of democracy that America has to offer. And they would say, this is the perfect place to be debating such consequential issues and speaking our minds about these important global events. And uphillers are like, we came here to see whether or not we would buy a new road grader, and it's like, Iraq War, road grader. And, why when we came, uphillers are like, let's deal with town events, not global events. So they sort of talk right past each other. The way that this has played itself out in the past is that the such ways as in that in the late 19th century, Downhillers did not understand why uphillers wanted to keep their schools in such poor shape. The big movement on the part of downhillers, the progressive class, the business types, was to consolidate schools, to run them on a town rather than a district level, to make them as modern as possible with highly educated teachers and standardized textbooks. And the uphillers fought this tooth and nail for about 150 years. And downhillers couldn't understand why. It revolved around the question of how do you keep the boys at home? How do you keep the boys on the farm? And downhillers genuinely believed that the problem why Vermont was losing so much of its young population was that staying on the farm was boring. It was stagnant. It was repressive. No exciting ideas were taking place on the farm. If you wanted to expand your ideas, expand your worldview, if you wanted to be progressive, if you wanted to encounter exciting concepts, the farm was the worst place to do it. So by making farming practices very progressive, and by making people more intelligent and having better rural book delivery and all of these other things, better educations, you would encourage people to stay home on the farm. But uphillers knew well that the more educated a kid is in the way that downhillers defined education, the more likely they were to leave. If you give a kid a taste of what the outside world is like, he's going to move to Boston. And they talked and completely past each other. They didn't understand each other on this level at all. And particularly in this case, downhillers in the late 19th century were at fault here because they defined themselves as educated and uphillers as not educated, whereas what they were truly was differently educated. Downhillers didn't know how to weave baskets or collect berries or to make stone walls or a lot of other things that were a very natural part of uphill life. And so therefore they talked right past each other. Farming practices is another example of this. Downhillers believed that if you modernized farms as much as possible and made uphillers embrace the latest in scientific advancements in the late 19th century, farming life would be improved and people would want to stay. But what uphillers knew was that you don't need to get rich on the farm in order to be happy. And indeed, many of these innovations would have resulted in the consolidation of farms, the forcing of people to move. It would have made them work harder when, frankly, one of the best things about uphill life was you worked hard, but you also had time for a meaningful communal life. And so therefore they rejected modern practices, whereas downhillers' slogan was scientific agriculture, uphillers had a slogan called small farms well tilled. And downhillers didn't understand that at all. Why keep your farm small? The answer is because then you had more neighbors. And so what happens is that downhillers are left peering across what I like to call the wave line. And this is something that I sort of decided existed in Vermont as my wife and I, one of our favorite things, and it may be many of your favorite things to do in Vermont as well, is to just drive on random roads, to take a Saturday afternoon and just pick a random road that is somewhere and go up it and see what you find. Is a great thing. And you're always going to find something fun when you go up on some random road, particularly if you live in Caledonia County. Addison County probably too. And I noticed this phenomenon where you pass this imaginary boundary, and once you cross over it, everyone that you see as you go by them waves at you. As if they squint, because they assume no one goes on the road unless it's someone they know. Do you know what I mean? And they're like, who bought a new car? And they wave at you like that. And now I would say to my wife, well, we're across the wave line, and everyone stops. And now, at the time when I thought of that, I lived in Essex, Vermont, which is not all that different. I moved there from central New Jersey, and Essex, Vermont is a lot more like central New Jersey, I must say, than it's like Danville. And now I live across a wave line in Danville, up on this mountain road, and I wave at everyone, raccoons, deer, everything that moves. Because I'm afraid people will be like, oh, there's those snotty New York City people again, and they don't wave at everyone. So for all I know, the wave line phenomenon is mostly really nervous downhillers who are afraid to appear special. But there is that wave line that exists where uphillers keep their secrets and downhillers don't understand them and try to inform them about the logical big picture. And the uphillers, for often perfectly logical reasons, don't get it. So this is sort of what I decided was the case. And the general framework like this then plays itself out in a conflicting argument about what and who is truly a Vermonter. And example of this, for instance, is in 1891. This is one of my, I have lots of quotes like this, but I'll pull this one out. A guy named J. Gregory Smith, who was the owner of the Central Vermont Railroad and an ex-governor, was speaking to the Vermont Board of Agriculture and trying to persuade the farmers who might read the reports that they should stop complaining about railroad rates, and being that he owned the main railroad in the state, and said that sinister self-appointed spokespeople for the farmers continually make efforts to arouse antagonism between the railroads and the farmers. The relationship between them would be harmonious if each farmer set himself to work and endeavor to solve his own share of the problems. I command you then to act like true Vermonters. Arouse within yourself the energy and force that characterize the Green Mountain Boys. Act like true Vermonters. And you run across quotes like that wherever you look in Vermont history. It's worth comparing it to a recent example, just from a couple weeks ago in the Burlington Free Press, in the letters to the editor. The columnist Ed Shamey had written complaining about the amount of snowfall we were having, and a reader wrote in, "Ed, you need to get over yourself. You're not a true Vermonter, and you never will be able to call yourself one, too. So we got some snow. Deal with it, because those of us who are real Vermonters want snow and are glad to see it come down." Which is like click, and put it in the file. And it's a beautiful thing. And it's very, there's a great deal of continuity there as far as that goes. The argument about who is and who isn't a Vermonter is a very special thing. It's beautiful in that it exists as a broad spectrum of definitions, that there are people believe that they have the one true definition, but that there are many true definitions. And also that it keeps the idea of Vermont as being a special place alive. And that's very important, the sense that we're embarked on a very special challenge, a experiment in human living, which was originally what Vermont was supposed to be from the beginning. Now, the essential last part of this is that it's true over time as always, is that the bottom line, though, is that uphillers and downhillers unfortunately need each other. And that is unfortunately always the case. And this is true from the beginning. The founding of Burlington in the 1790s was not a town that organically arose out of the dust, out of the field at the side of the lake, but rather some very wise people, particularly Ira Allen, knew that there would be farmers who settled in the hinterland around that area of Lake Champlain. It was fertile land in Williston and Heinsberg and Charlotte, and that they would need a metropolis of some kind where they could go to buy the things that they needed that were transported in from the outside, and where they could take their farming produce, their maple products and potash and et cetera, to ship out. And so therefore, Burlington only arose at the same pace that the farming communities in its exterior arose, and the exterior farmland could only grow as fast as Burlington could support their way of life, with the result that in this case from the beginning and ever after, uphillers and downhillers, whether fortunately or not fortunately, they need each other, and always will, which further complicates the relationship, unfortunately, but will always be the case. Now, while these things are all true, I just want to point out, though, that, of course, these categories also have evolved enormously over time, and this then became the problem, as Jim might remember, is that once I'd convinced you that it was the same now as then, I had to completely convince you that it was very, very different, and that these categories, both uphill and downhill, had evolved over time. I've had my share of people give me their concern that, in fact, the uphill way of life is very endangered, is very threatened, and I believe that's probably true as a result of very large forces. I've had people tell me that uphillers are an endangered species in Vermont, and I think that's probably in many ways true as well. But the thing about uphill life as well as downhill life is that it's never been locked in time in the first place. It has always evolved enormously. You can't just build a monorail for the tourists that goes over top of uphill villages where they can look down and build a fence around it so the uphillers don't get iPods and internet access and then observe them in their native habitat. It's never been the case that they've stood still in time, ever. A number of the most important ways in which it's different, first of all, of course, as many of you know, the imbalance of numbers between uphillers and downhillers is almost essentially reversed over the course of the century. There were very few downhillers with a much disproportionate amount of power to their numbers in the late 19th century. And now, you know, there are a lot more downhillers in the state than uphillers. As far as farming goes, one of the phenomenon that I really believe to be true is that compared to the late 19th century, downhillers tend now to farm in uphill ways, while uphillers farm in downhill ways. Downhillers now are very devoted to sort of small-scale production, organically giving back to the earth, whereas, because it's cool. Whereas, and it's good, whereas uphillers by necessity have to engage in the latest scientific advances. They have to produce milk or whatever they're producing on a large scale because they have to. And that's the case. Even as far as residences, and this has been something people pointed out to me, is that the residential pattern has reversed almost entirely. If you want to find where the downhillers live now, you have to go out to some mountaintop with a view and find a McMansion. Whereas if you want to find a true uphiller, you have to go to the worst bar in Burlington's Old North End, and there you will find, you know, the last vestiges of true, authentic uphill Vermont. So even that's reversed. And I mean, perhaps the most important thing is the political element, which is to say that the reapportionment of the legislature in 1965 really did matter a great deal on a big scale. The state legislature was the bastion of uphill power for 150, 170 years in this state. And when they reapportioned it, uphillers essentially lost their voice, which led to the large number of consequences which played itself over time through the Take Back Vermont movement and right up to the present. Most of all, the two biggest differences is that, first of all, the greatest difference, if I could in any way convey to you, at least my understanding, and it's become clear to me as I live in Danville now, is that what's changed about uphill life is how localized, incredibly intensely localized it used to be in the late 19th century, in ways I'm only beginning still to appreciate now. You take away cars and even trains and telephones and radios and television and the internet and state services and federal government services and all these other things, and what you're left with is little island kingdoms in which people knew each other and knew each other over generations and cooperated with each other and served on multiple town committees and offices, and those offices really mattered. And what has happened over time, of course, is that the world got much bigger, it got much faster, the centripetal nature of life in these small towns became increasingly much broader and less, narrowly focused. And we'll never go back again to that incredibly intensely town-focused way in which we knew the world. And what's changed the most about downhillers is that starting in the late 19th century, really, and increasingly more over time, is that downhillers have begun to understand, and are still learning about, the law of diminishing returns. That the more you develop and have progress and change the world, you also lose things as well. This really originated in tourism in the late 19th century, and in the formation of the contemporary identity of Vermont, you can't overstate how important tourism is. Because at first, they did a study of summer tourism. There was only anecdotal evidence in the 1890s it was important. They did a study in 1894 of how important tourism was, and it turned out it was the second biggest industry in the state, and which blew downhillers away, but immediately made them think, well, now here's a new resource that we can exploit in order to move Vermont forward. We can use tourism as a way of making Vermont modern. We'll take that money and we'll invest it in the infrastructure and may have better schools and better roads and better services and a bigger state government and all these other things, not appreciating yet that they stood the great risk of destroying the very thing that tourists were looking for, which is to say, a place that wasn't like New Jersey or Connecticut, a place that ran according to old rules and old ways of life. They would speak in the same issue of a magazine about how Vermont had made such extraordinary advances in its educational infrastructure and had consolidated district schools into town schools and had made such progress in education. And then a couple pages later would say to ask tourists to come home for Old Home Week to your small town where still the beauty of the little red schoolhouse prevails. And America still survives in its resplendent pastoral and backward beauty. You can't easily have both things at the same time, but what downhillers began to understand over time was that there's such a thing as going too fast, and that there's a lot of things about uphill life that are worth preserving, and that if you can only listen to uphillers describe what is most valuable to them and why they do the things they do, then you can learn from them how to move forward at a pace which preserves the best aspects of traditional life. The problem, though, is that downhillers have never listened enough, and that is truly the case. So there's even the debate about who is a Vermonter has evolved a great deal over time. Nativity has always mattered, but since the influx of people in the 1960s and 1970s, it matters a great deal more than it ever has. On the other hand, ethnicity does not matter anywhere near as much as it ever did. Anyone in Vermont who would say someone was not a Vermonter on the basis of their French-Canadian heritage would appropriately be treated as an idiot in this state. And so even this debate about who is a Vermonter continues to evolve and thankfully continues to be important and continues to be relevant. But the distinction remains. What's needed in Vermont to have talked about similarities and then to have talked about differences, to wrap this up, is to get back to similarities and get back to the lessons that Vermont can teach the rest of the globe. Is because downhillers never have often wanted what uphillers have, or have wanted to preserve what uphillers have, but haven't necessarily listened to them closely enough and let uphillers teach them the lesson about how to go about doing that. Living in a small town like Danville, as I do now, I know that there's a level of community I'll never penetrate. You know, we bought our house from an old Danville family named the Websters, and 50 years from now, if we're still living in that house, people in town will still call it the what? Which is great, which is important, because a town needs that kind of community. Community is not buildings or a ground or a town green. Community is shared experiences. Community can only arise over a long period of time. It accrues like a coral reef. And if you destroy community in a town, you lose what's most precious about it. And I know, even though I'll never penetrate to the level that the Websters or other families old-time families in Danville have penetrated the town, I know that it informs and improves and enriches my life on a day-to-day basis at the recycling center and at the mini-mart and everywhere else I go, in the way that my children are treated and my wife are treated and everything else. So that's the goal. What downhillers have theoretically learned over time to varying degrees of success is the principle of diminishing returns, and that there's something very special about small towns on their own terms. The great historian of the city, Lewis Mumford, described the original Puritan villages, which were replicated in Vermont's early experience in the Gilded Age, to a great extent, as the ideal democratic polity, a town green with the great institutions of public life around it, the school, the church, the town hall, and a cattle reeve who watched over everyone's animals while they farmed, and a meaningful sense of community. Halfway between the land monopolies of the Middle Ages and the urban megalopolises of the present stood the New England model of the village, and it was the ideal democratic polity, he said. But he said it could only survive as long as one thing was true. And what that is? It has to remain on a what? A small scale. It's exactly right. However, now Vermont has the responsibility of proving that to be wrong. That indeed you can take the lessons from the small town, from the cooperative nature of life, and embrace progress, and reconcile those things. That you can reconcile freedom and unity, you can reconcile progress and tradition, you can reconcile development and preservation. All of those things can be put together, and especially considering the resources we have at our disposal in the 21st century, now I would say is the time when we should worry about this. The nature of politics is to emphasize the differences between people and to point them out and to make your opponents look evil or bad or at least misguided. But cooperatively in Vermont, we can actually plan for naturalness. I think one of the things about Vermont now, which is increasingly true, is that the division in Vermont in the past used to be between individuals, uphillers and downhillers. Increasingly over time, what's happened is that the two groups are converging, and that the basic division between the needs of the individual and the community exists within ourselves, within individuals. And what happened is that we can encourage now progress, I think, in a way that cultivates tradition. We can give back to the earth even in ways that we take from it. We can recognize each other's mutual love for the state, even as we hotly contest the way forward and argue about who is and isn't a Vermonter. In 1904, which was a very contentious period in Vermont's history, the Hardwick Gazette bitterly denounced those who wanted to repeal its new local option law, which allowed some big towns to sell liquor while the small towns refused to sell liquor. The small towns were opposing this, and the Hardwick Gazette said, "Those preoccupied with repealing local option are extremists, little fellows who see things but their own way, and one way, and that's their own," which easily could be said about the Hardwick Gazette and the downhillers who were saying this, just as well it could be said about uphillers as well. That was the problem with both of them now. To a great extent, but not as much, that's still the problem today. People need to do a better job of listening in Vermont to each other today, as opposed to arguing, because the world's depending on Vermont in order to show it the way to reconcile all these contrasting conditions of human existence. There's perfectly good reasons to be discouraged about the way forward. Frank Bryan, who teaches political science at the University of Vermont, wrote this in 1974 in his book Yankee Politics in Rural Vermont. He said, "What the world desperately needs is the community axiom, which promises a return to the good old days, to traditional American values, to a simple life of interpersonal relations where individuals still control events in society generally and in the government as well." But he continued, Frank Bryan did, to say that if you move to Vermont, you'll be disappointed because the system axiom is taken over. Vermont is left inefficient and bureaucratic. It conducts decision-making in a centralized location, disdains town meetings as a quaint ritual to placate the community types. Thus, Vermonters are heavily taxed, isolated by choice, spiteful to outsiders, like everyone else. These are powerful ideas, and that's 33 years ago, because it could still be said about now. It strikes at the heart of what Vermont means. And of course, Frank is totally accurate in identifying the operating principle at work, which is to say modernity. The world's getting more modern, it's getting more complex, it's getting bigger and faster, but also smaller at the same time. But it's not a reason to throw up your hands in the air and give up, but rather it's sort of a call to action, as you define it. Because if there's one thing that Vermont's history can tell you, it's that everyone in Vermont over time, ultimately, no matter how different they were, wanted the same things: preservation, development, progress, tradition, civility, tolerance, freedom, unity. Everyone in Vermont has always wanted that. It's a goal, never perfectly achieved, always strive for. But considering where we are now, if we can plot the right course for the future, I would say, why not us? And why not now? And that's what the lesson Vermont has to teach the world. Does that make sense? Okay. Thank you. Now, the boring part for me is over, and I came in right on the deadline I was sort of given. And I appreciate your patience. It was told to me that it should be a longer talk than I would usually burden people with. But for those of you, anyone who wants to go home, I will not be offended. But I would really like, would you please, you wanted to say something, please.
Yes, I'm here primarily to answer the question someone raised to me in community chorus. I've lived here 20 years, he said. We try to blend in. They don't, no ostentation, very low key. Our house was attacked with tomatoes and eggs at Halloween. They hate us. I don't don't know what to do. I think we're going to move away. Why should I stay here? I came here in hopes that I could answer the question. And you haven't really touched on economics. The fact is that she has choices that those who throw tomatoes don't have. And I would love to hear anything you have to say on the topic.
It's a
Would
long-standing
you
problem.
mind repeating the question?
I'm sorry. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, but just for the recording.
For the recording,
Yes.
the problem is that you see yourself as representative of the kinds of clashes that arise over differing economic positions across the state. Is that correct? You know you're not an isolated example, and you've recently encountered some vandalism by resentful locals.
On behalf of my friend, she asked me
Oh.
the question, yes.
Yes, you know, I mean, one of the great examples of this sort of uphill-downhill conflict, if you want to know uphill-downhill still exists in Vermont today, you go to a high school parking lot and look at the different cars people drive. CVU is like this. You can see who's from Starksboro and who's from Shelburne. And, I mean, historians tend to diagnose problems but not come up with solutions for them. But the gist of what I guess I'm trying to say is that there needs to be a cooperative way forward in which people mutually understand that they can learn from each other and dependent on each other, you know? And it doesn't necessarily make any sense for those people to be resentful when immigrants to the state, those who are wealthy, have so much to offer the state. At the same time, it can really be a problem for some people when a family that's lived in a town for a long time in a house that has their name associated with it, sells it. A family moves in from outside, fixes it up or lives in it for a year, turns around and sells it for $200,000 more than they bought it for. And, you know, this has happened also in town after town. It's not an easy thing to work out, but it hopefully will move forward in a way in which we can sort of listen to each other as opposed to throw eggs at each other's windows. I don't know, does anyone else have a better solution than that? Yes, please.
Well, I'm an uphilder. My family comes from Vermont way, way, way back, and we've been farm families forever, and college graduates and all of that sort of thing. But we had a family who bought a house in town, and when they moved in, they were suddenly better than anybody else. They didn't speak to anybody. They didn't know anybody. And, you know, I mean, we didn't, you know, uphillers don't run over and, you know, my grandmother used to carry a dish, but we don't say, you're new in town, aren't you? You know, we just don't do that. And so, and these people put no trespassing signs on all their land, which included our swimming hole. So when Halloween came around, they had a dead cat stuffed in their mailbox. And everybody felt that they deserved it. Well, since then, we realized that they're almost human. They're pretty good people, you know. But if they had been a little bit more conscientious about blending in rather than wanting to make changes, they would have been accepted much better. And we didn't throw eggs, but I think it's only because the boys that did those things didn't think of it.
Well, I think you could explain this more articulately than I could, which is to ask a leading question, how long would they be referred to as the new people?
Until people got to know and like them.
So, 10 years?
Simple as
Oh.
that. No,
It
no.
differs depending on what.
Some people in a year,
Yeah.
if their kids go to school and they go to PTA meetings and they say hello to everybody and they go to the library and they're friendly and, you know, they take things to the suppers and they join into the community. But to buy land and put a fence around it and come on weekends, you're not gonna have any friends. It just doesn't work that way.
Yes, because the town works, and it doesn't need to be changed.
Yeah.
Yes.
It is hard work to be a member of a community.
Yes,
It's not easy, it's hard.
yes, I understand. Yeah, please.
I read your book, by the way.
Hey, thanks.
And I thought
My mother and you. Anyway,
I
yes.
thought your analysis was very good for the time frame, that is up to 1910. And it even could be carried forward when I was a boy in the 50s. I'm seventh generation Vermonter on both sides, but not a farmer. But today, what's uphill? I lived in a town of 600 people. Happened to have the same number by the time of the Civil War. But there were 100 farms, and virtually all the 600 people lived on a farm. Today, we have 600 people. There are 6 farms, and there may be 30 people living on them, but probably not even that many. We're a commuter town. Everybody has to get in a car and go somewhere else. Their attitudes are very different. Even though they may be native Vermonters, their attitudes are no longer the same as they were even 50 years ago. And I know that's pretty generally true in Rutland County. And I suspect it's true in much of the state. Maybe agricultural prosperity in Addison County gives you a reprieve from it, but for most of the state, there's no such thing as agricultural prosperity. It's
Yeah,
hanging on and hoping.
yes.
So what's uphill now?
Well, you know when you see one pretty often. You know, I'm as downhill as they come. I own a chainsaw, though. That makes me a little now. And I know exactly the process that you're talking about. When I moved to Essex Center in the mid-1990s, it was sort of the edge of sort of what you would call downhill sprawl, you know. And in the time between then and now, it's taken over Jericho and whatever the other towns heading out that way are, you know, all the way out through Westford, you know. You can see it's spreading and spreading and spreading, and the old families get displaced. And the sad thing is that what a lot of the people who are moving to these towns are looking for is the very thing that they're driving out. And that is absolutely the case. And what needs to, I mean, is there a way to solve this? I think there is, but it requires sacrifices, and it requires people to listen to each other and to move forward collectively. And you know, that's, I think, what the Vermont Council on Rural Development is trying to figure out how to do. And we live at a very special time. If action isn't taken, will there still be traces of uphill Vermont left in 30 years? Do you think so?
Oh, there'll be traces of it because culture hangs on a long time.
It'll be up in Holland, though, or some other town no one ever goes to. Reseeding the resources. Jim, you want to say, I'm sorry, you had your hand up?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think it may have been this venue for Jonathan Schur. Are you at all familiar? He's from New Jersey, and basically they were trying to address the economic train that they saw steaming down the tracks, just as we have, and you had mentioned it to begin. So maybe somebody can do better justice to his. The essential premise, I think, was that they were having a dialogue, the people with fairly large wealth knew that their door was going to be knocked on, and essentially didn't want it to feel like theft. They were expecting the conversation, and were ready to have that conversation. And I'm quite sure that it was a speaker here. Chris, does that ring a bell? Jonathan Schur, S-H-U-R-E.
No, it
Anyway.
doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Is somebody else?
Did he just diagnose the problem, or did he have solutions?
They were hammering it out in terms of, obviously an aging population and some economic tax issues that were going to be imminent. And they really were maybe not near a solution, but moving closer.
And a general sense in Vermont that, 30 years from now we can be a state in crisis which has lost its identity, or we can be a state with a thriving identity which is stable and move forward intelligently. And it's really ours to choose. I think we're in control of the process, but we have to sort of figure it out now. Yeah, please.
I'm curious about what you said about the Vermont Constitution being such a radical document. I'm curious whether it was written by uphillers or downhillers. And if it was written by uphillers, were they acting against their own self-interest, or was it some burst of enlightenment? I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that.
It was written by uphillers. Not one college graduate, not one lawyer sullied the process of writing the Constitution. They were also, what they did was they took a lot of Pennsylvania's Constitution and parts of Connecticut's Constitution and threw them in, the parts that they liked. And they threw in then some other radical ideas, such as universal manhood suffrage, except Catholics for a little while, but we won't talk about that. And a couple of other, fairly radical things. A direct quote, someone who would directly say that it was the most radical document of the Revolutionary period, is Randolph Roth in The Democratic Dilemma, which is a book that everyone interested in Vermont should read. And yes, what they ended up doing, a lot of these farmers were quite traditionally oriented. They, had come out of a puritanical tradition in which people's primary focus in life was sacrificing the needs of the individual for the well-being of the community. These were very narrow, consensus-driven places from which they'd come. And they did often, in the excitement of the revolutionary era, a lot of these ideas sounded great, but they committed themselves to contradictory values, some of which were very much contrary to what they believed to be good. So, yes, but it was written by uphillers. Absolutely. Although, Jim, did we ever decide if Ethan Allen was uphill or downhill? He was a land speculator, after all. Yeah, Ira was much more downhill than Ethan was. That's my belief. Yeah, please.
Well, what about the political split between uphillers and downhillers, liberal versus conservative, in the modern context, Republican, Democrat?
It's much more interesting than that, I would say to you. There are elements of uphill life that are much more, you would even say, progressive or liberal or independence or individuality oriented than downhill life. Uphill and downhill isn't really about liberal or conservative. It's much more interesting than that. I lived, in Essex, which is one of the most downhill places that Vermont has to offer by far, and that was on the whole a resoundingly Republican town. But that didn't make it uphill by any means. Not Essex. It operates on different levels than that. It's about that, but it's about a lot of other things as well. Is that a brief but articulate answer? Do you want to refine your question a little bit?
Well, Vermont's popular belief is that it is an intensely liberal state, right? Now, on the whole. Its antecedents go back to the first to abolish slavery and universal manhood suffrage, et cetera, et cetera. The first Negro to graduate from a four-year college was in Vermont. And yet, a long tradition of Republican governors. I'm just curious as to how you reconcile those things against the backdrop of your downhill-uphill thesis.
It's a really big question. The Republican Party used to be very different from what it is now. It was the party of Lincoln and the party of the Underground Railroad. It was also the party of the robber barons, and those things had to coexist. The party of progressive reformers and also the people whose trust they were trying to bust. And in Vermont, in the same way, the Republican Party was the party of the uphillers and downhillers alike who tended often to hate each other. What gradually happened over time is that that couldn't hold. By the 1930s, the Republican Party was bifactional, split between what was sort of the progressive wing, the Aiken-Gibson wing, and the old guard, the Proctor wing. And that paved the way, eventually, naturally, to being a two-party state. But what's important is that both uphillers and downhillers, both Republicans and Democrats, can claim Vermont's historical heritage of being against the national grain as their own. You know what I mean? We can all take pride in the fact that Vermont was the first to abolish slavery, or that Clarina Nichols spoke before the state legislature in 1853, or anything else along those lines. It's more about worldviews than it is about political issues that defines the two sides. So without getting into an elaborate description of party politics. The way that it was organized up until reapportionment in 1965 was that uphillers controlled the legislature because of the one-town, one-vote rule, and downhillers controlled the Senate. And they sort of canceled each other out and never got anything done, which is how a lot of people kind of liked it at the time. But if you were to say, were the downhillers at the time more liberal? Well, on the one hand, they believed more in women's right to vote, but on the other hand, they believed that railroad owners should be able to set their own rates without any regulation. Whereas uphillers believe women, basically the man spoke for the woman in a farm household, but that you needed a lot of structures and government in place in order to make it so that there was more economic equity. So it's more interesting than liberal and conservative. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, please.
I'm just wondering if the two sides come together during the Civil War, having a common enemy in the South, because it seems, I'm a newcomer, but one thing that has really been clear to me is the tremendous sacrifice that Vermont towns, very small towns, made in the Civil War. Here in Middlebury and in Green, you see this monument, and there must be, I don't know, 50 names of soldiers who perished just from this little town. And so anyhow, I've been thinking a lot about this, and applying this to your speech here, I'm wondering, maybe what Vermont needs is a common enemy. And that would bring everybody together, and then did it work during the Civil War era?
Doesn't New Jersey work for most of you? New Hampshire is probably a closer example. No, get a lot of time in New Hampshire. It's true. You know, it was a unity, but it was a very temporary one. It glossed over a lot of and people sort of put aside a lot of their conflicts temporarily. One of my favorite examples is that there's this fellow John Phelps who was the head of the Vermont regiment, and when he was seen striding into New York City at the head of this brigade of Green Mountainers, he was described as being like Ethan Allen in the flesh, all revisited, reborn. And his grandfather had been one of the first downhillers. His grandfather hated Ethan Allen, But temporarily it was an icon everyone could use. But it only patched over the differences. It didn't make them go away. I mean, do we need to have an outside enemy in order to,
No, I agree with you.
I think we've got enough on our plate here in the state to sort out, and quickly. So the enemy is us. That makes sense? Yeah, please.
I lived in the Northeast Kingdom in the late 1990s, 2000, during that era, and I found the Barton Chronicle to be the most amazing paper to read for those culture wars. But simultaneously with the civil unions debate, there was this post movement, I don't know if you recall, where it was protesting against a law that made that you could not clear cut forests more than 40 acres. And there was, in the Northeast Kingdom anyway, there's a huge brouhaha, and those who opposed, the post movement, who opposed this, were very eager to cast it as an uphill or down, true Vermonters versus the Flatlanders, and it's those tree-hugging Flatlanders who are preventing us from doing it. And so there you had some people very eager to deploy this distinction, which is your thesis. But the trouble was that I think it masked what the real interests were and where the real divides were, and plus it prevented people from finding common ground or debating in any kind of rational way up there. So I'm just raising a caveat about the usefulness of the distinction. It can become a tool to exacerbate, to worsen debate, and it really covers over what's really going on, what the conflict really may be about.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I mean, on the one hand, it would be really sad if we didn't continue to engage in this long-term discourse about who is a Vermonter, and there were a range of opinions. Because that's something very special. What it means is we're constantly revisiting the idea of what should we be now and where should we go in the future. But again, I mean, I agree with you. People need to listen to each other as well. And, appreciate that there's something that we can learn from each other, as different as we are. And that can be... The problem with the phrase "Take Back Vermont" at the time was that it was destined to fail. And I felt like that at the time. Because it was like, take it back to what? Before the downhillers were here? That's the 1770s, I mean, what they should have been saying was share Vermont, and they would have been speaking across the chasm. But instead they were only talking to themselves. So they were destined to go nowhere. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But what brought the post movement to an end was, as the winter time approached, a lot of the post movement was that we will protest this by posting our property. But then you see the vast trails ran all over the place in the Northeast Kingdom. And this whole source of a very Vermont activity of snowmobiling was threatened to be shut down. And so in the face of that, the thing fizzled and revealed that it wasn't some sort of flatlander versus true locals, true Vermonter, uphill Vermonters conflict at all.
Yep.
Does the discussion go on a true Vermonter in other states who's a true New Jerseyite?
I've spent a lot of time worrying about this. There's only one other state that cares as much as me is my thesis. And what it is? Texas. And Maine cares a great deal too. Indiana to some extent. Not that I'm encouraging anyone to move to Texas or anything like that. In fact, Texans really care a great deal. People from Maine would vehemently disagree with this. It may be because Vermont and Texas were the only two states that were once independent countries. But these are two places that really care a great deal about national identity, their state identity, and speak about it in specific terms, in terms of it's a way of examining where we are and what we should do in order to preserve the best things about who we are. In Maine, I think to a great extent, it's more of a conflict between people who live near Portland and people who live up in the woods. But people from Maine would throw rocks at me for saying that. There's a lot of places where there's conflict between people who have lived there originally and others have moved in, like Oregon, New Mexico, because they're inundated with Californians, have this sort of, I'm an original Oregonian, Nevada. But Vermont, it's been a debate that's taken place for 240 years, which is different. Yeah, please.
There's quite a divide between this side of the state and the other side of the state as well. I would consider myself to be very uphill Addison County, small town Panton, Vermont. I married a fellow from Groton, and I am downhill compared to the people there. They're still reeling that the general store is gone and someone's put a solar store in there. They don't understand how someone selling solar equipment is going to make it, there. And they look at this side of the state as faster paced, and which it is. But it's interesting to listen and me being able to identify both roles, uphill where I am, where I live, where I grew up, but feeling so downhill when we go to the other side of the state.
Well, I'll tell you that a lot of people in Danville think that Chittenden County, Williston is exactly what's gone wrong with Vermont. But they think they're a lot better than people from Groton, I'll tell you what. And people know what Groton is like. They think they're better than people from Walden, too. So, the towns adjacent to each other. But, one thing that, I've really had people, I don't know how my book would have been different if I'd lived in Danville when I'd written it. But I do hear things like people, so there's 3 brothers, and they'll say, yeah, 2 of them are, still around, but one of them moved away. He moved to Barnet. And that really matters. In 1902, during the election in 1902, there was 3 downhill candidates, and then the Prohibition Party candidate was a Methodist minister. And he was in Marshfield, and his campaign biography said that when he'd moved to Marshfield as their new minister, people had been really resentful of him and, had been very not willing to accept him unless he proved himself, et cetera, et cetera. And he grew up in Plainfield, which was next door. But Marshfield wasn't Plainfield. They were different places with their own sort of little insular worlds. It's less true than it used to be, but it's still true. Does that make sense? Yeah, please, yeah.
I think it's interesting that the lady behind me, who's a downhiller from Panton to the other side of the state, I think it's interesting that they have the interstate that connects them to Boston and Montreal and Connecticut, and we don't. And we're always calling for the interstate so that we can be part of the rest of the world.
Well, the interstate, if you think about it, you've been over there, the interstate has had the effect of making it so that the small towns stay small because New Hampshire doesn't have a sales tax. And all the businesses, it's really bad for St. Johnsbury, but you ride through fields and countrysides and farms, and then you go across a bridge and there's fast food stores and gas stations and Walmarts and Home Depots are on the other side of the border, with the result that there's very little economic activity right along that corridor. So, the west side of the state doesn't have that problem. So that's kind of kept Vermont small. A lot of people would say for the worse. Kept the east side county's small. Does that make sense?
Not really, but.
Oh, yes. Take a drive
Yes and
over
no.
there and go across like Route 2 between Lunenburg and whatever's on the other side, Groveton, New Hampshire. And there's nothing on the Lunenburg side and everything's on the Groveton side. Everyone in the one side drives across Route 2 to shop and then turns around and comes back. There's no economic activity over there at all. It's sad. But that was their revenge for whatever. I don't know what we did to them that made them do that to us in New Hampshire. Yeah, please.
Isn't what's being identified here a totally different phenomenon? The 251 republics. Every town has its own culture. Towns side by side, that anyone who drove through them would say, well, what's the difference? Regard themselves as completely, we wouldn't be like those people in Danby or Middletown Springs or Clarendon, in my case.
Yeah.
And there really are important differences.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
I mean,
Uphill and downhill doesn't count for it at all.
you know, yeah, no, but like school consolidation, the creation of union schools in the 1950s, I'm waiting to write an article about this because it's one of the best examples of the whole who is a Vermonter and how do we move forward debate. You know what I'm talking about. Is that, I mean, a lot of these small town schools were awful, but it was the heart of the town. And when they were removed from the towns never have recovered their sense of identity.
We have 37 kids in our school, and we will not close them.
And you know exactly what it does for your town. You know? I mean, it's the heart of the community. The pillar of the republic, as the Puritans used to call it.
Town, it would make a huge difference in the culture of the town if there were no school.
Yeah.
It is, in my opinion, is totally true.
Mhm.
It is inefficient, it is expensive, although putting kindergartners on a bus for 2 hours a day is not very efficient either.
Yeah, please.
Yes.
Okay, please.
I have a question about Bernie Sanders. He seems like the one politician that I can think of currently in Vermont who appeals to both the uphill and the downhill type of Vermonter. And I've always been interested and puzzled by how he does that. But would you agree that that's the case, and how would you explain how he's able to bridge all those divides?
Well, I would never even hope to remotely say that I could explain uphiller logic to you, because downhillers don't understand uphillers, and I'm the most downhill guy in the state. However, it's a great political trick to be both uphill and downhill at the same time. Now, if you're not a politician, or if you're a politician at times, it can be very an uncomfortable place to be. You know, uphill and downhill is a spectrum, and we all exist on places along the spectrum. It's not actually two discrete groups. You have to assume that. A politician who can position himself in the middle, like George Aiken did, is guaranteed to be in office until he chooses not to be, or dies, or something like that. Our current governor, Governor Douglas, I think does a lot better job of positioning himself in the middle. Though he's a Middlebury graduate, and there's no uphillers graduate from Middlebury. If they're uphill when they get there, they're downhill when they leave. That's what colleges do. That's my job, is to turn perfectly good uphillers and take them and ruin them and make them downhill. That's what college professors do. I don't think, you know, Bernie necessarily tries hard to position himself as being one who understands uphillers, and therefore a lot of them would call him, you know, that damn socialist. But he does good things for them. I think on a practical level, when I've asked people who are uphill to varying extents, as much as they resent who he is, he gets things done. You know, they appreciate what he does in terms of farms, they appreciate what he does in terms of veterans, and a lot more uphillers serve in the military than downhillers do. And so, I mean, they appreciate what he does for them. And I don't even think they hold their noses when they vote for him. You know, and I mean, the last election, it was like 70% of the state voted for Douglas and 70% voted for Bernie, something like that. There's 40% of the people who voted for both of them, you know, and it's because they thought they were the people who were best suited for the job, who act in their own best interest. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense?
Well, I never will. I'll never really understand it. But I think when you go to a rally or an event or something for Bernie, you see people there that you never see at any other political event, and because he has these spaghetti suppers, and you'll see all kinds of types of people there. And I just think it's fascinating. They're not there because they're holding their noses. I mean, they really genuinely like him, and he couldn't be more downhill, so, in some ways. So it's just, you know, somehow he has that common touch where he's able to talk to all kinds of people.
Yeah. Yeah, do people know Governor Dean's official governor's portrait? The one where he's in a canoe? And it's like, oh, please, you're embarrassing yourself, you know? Because now, there's nothing more pathetic than a downhiller who pretends he's uphill. It's true. This is the principle. I didn't talk about this, but does this make sense? You can start uphill and become downhill. It happens all the time. It happened to Calvin Coolidge. That's my job. Like, so you can start uphill and become downhill, but you can't be downhill and become uphill. It's impossible. Uphill, this is why they're an endangered species, because there's an uphill way of life is about multiple generations. It's about how you think. Just because you have a pickup truck and a big dog does not make you uphill. You can't, so. It's true. Is that it? Right at 8:30. Thank you very much. All right. Just one more thing for you to think about when you go home. Thank you very, very much.